Being a saint doesn't typically align with burning down a city, unless of course you're a 10th century Kievan princess. Now it's one thing to become a saint by doing saintly stuff, but to be honest, Saint Olga of Kyiv deserves a trophy for managing to balance her taste for enacting gruesome acts of vengeance with her path to heavenly salvation. To understand Olga's wild journey, we first need to set the stage. The 10th century was not for the faint of heart. This was the early medieval period, a time when Eastern Europe was a patchwork of tribal confederations, budding kingdoms, and Viking-descended rulers trying to crave out power in a very messy world. Kievan Rus, Olga's domain, was one of these emerging powers. Kievan Rus wasn't a unified nation as we would think of today. It was more of a loose federation of city-states and principalities ruled by the Varangians, a group of Norse traders and warriors who settled in Eastern Europe. They controlled key trade routes between the Baltic and Black Seas, becoming fabulously wealthy of trade in furs, slaves, and honey. But wealth brought trouble, and Kievan Rus often found itself clashing with neighboring tribes like the Drevlians. This is when Prince Igor, Olga's husband, enters the scene. Igor inherited the throne of Kiev and, like most rulers of the time, spent much of his reign dealing with unruly subjects. The Drevlians in particular were a thorn in his side. They had briefly paid tribute to Kiev, but stopped after Igor's father's death. Now, life in the medieval world is already a balancing act between raiding, ruling, and not dying of dysentery, but things take a sharp turn when Igor decides to pull a fast one on the Drevlians. In 945 AD, Igor marched to the Drevlians to demand tribute. Now, negotiating with the Drevlians was risky business. They weren't exactly known for their diplomacy. They paid up at first, but when Igor returned to demand even more, their patience ran out. What followed was one of the most brutal executions in history. The Drevlians tied Igor to two bent trees, and then let nature take its course. When the trees were released, let's just say Igor didn't make it. Now here comes our protagonist. At this point, Olga was the widowed queen and regent for her young son. Most women in her position might have focused on securing their son's future or rallying allies to stabilize the kingdom. But Olga wasn't most women. She had no intention of letting her husband's killer get away with murder. The Drevlians, thinking they'd pull off the coup of the century, had the audacity to send a delegation to Olga with a marriage proposal. Their pitch was something along the lines of, "Hey, we killed your husband, but how about you marry one of our guys instead? Win-win, right?" Their logic was simple. If Olga married one of their leaders, they could consolidate power and avoid retaliation. What they didn't realize was that Olga wasn't in a forgiving mood. At first, she instructed her servants to dig a massive pit, then invited the envoys over, and in an act of poetic justice, had them thrown into the pit and buried alive. But Olga wasn't done. When the Drevlians didn't get the memo, they sent a second delegation to negotiate. Olga, keeping her calm, said, "Of course, come on in, why don't you freshen up first?" She offered them a bathhouse, which they happily entered. Olga then locked the doors and set the entire structure on fire, roasting them alive. At this point, you'd think the Drevlians might reconsider their strategy, but they still somehow were convinced she wasn't mad about the whole husband murder thing. So they threw a massive banquet in her honor. Olga waited until everyone was well and truly drunk, before unleashing her troops, who massacred the partygoers. But even this wasn't enough. Olga then launched a full-scale military campaign against the Drevlians, laying siege to their capital. Medieval sieges were grueling affairs, often dragging on for months or even years. Supplies would run out, disease would spread, and morale would crumble. But Olga wasn't interested in waiting. She offered the besieged Drevlians what seemed like a merciful deal: surrender, and in exchange, pay a small tribute of 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows for each household. The Drevlians, desperate to end the siege, gladly complied. What they didn't know was that Olga had no intention of letting them off easy. She ordered her soldiers to tie sulfur and burning cloth to the birds. When released, the birds flew back to their nest in the city, setting the capital ablaze. The city burned to the ground, and any survivors were captured or killed. With her vengeance complete, Olga returned to Kiev as a legend. But her story doesn't end there. In a surprising plot twist, Olga converted to Christianity a few years later. Accounts differ on exactly when and how, but it's generally believed she was baptized in Constantinople, the heart of the Byzantine Empire. Her conversion was a significant moment for Kievan Rus. Christianity was spreading throughout Europe, and Olga's embrace of the faith laid the groundwork for her grandson, Vladimir the Great, to officially Christianize the region. Despite her earlier reign of terror, the church hailed Olga as a pioneer of the faith, eventually canonizing her as a saint. So how does a woman who buried her enemies alive, set a bathhouse on fire, and torched an entire city become a saint? The answer lies in the medieval church's priorities. The medieval church had a knack for overlooking a colorful past if it meant furthering the faith. So for the church, Olga's rule in bringing Christianity to Eastern Europe outweighed her, shall we say, creative methods of conflict resolution, I guess. Her story also reflects the complexities of medieval rulers. Olga was a woman of contradictions, ruthless yet devout, vengeful yet visionary. Olga's legacy endures not just as a saint, but as a symbol of resilience and determination. She shattered the notion that women in medieval Europe were passive figures, proving they could be formidable leaders, cunning strategists, and of course, saints. Albeit with a path to sainthood that blazed as fearlessly as her vengeance. Perhaps her story is best summed up by the saying, "The road to heaven feels like hell." Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed Saint Olga's tale, then you won't want to miss this video. Until the next time.